Big tech has changed the scale and speed of just about everything we do, from the news to the power to, all of it.
The utility customer of 50 years ago is not the same as the utility customer of today.
It's not just about powering servers or systems. It's really about we're connecting people and communities and futures.
We deliver the greatest product of all time to people in a way that's reliable, clean, cost-effective.
There's huge demand growth from AI and data centers. Imagine you're 5 stories in the air, balancing on a tightrope while entire swaths of the country watch. Now imagine you're doing that while keeping all of those spectators' lights on. I imagine that's kind of what it feels like to run a utility these days. This balancing act is tough. Leaders are juggling explosive new load from data centers and electrification, intense pressure to integrate renewables, and persistent customer demands for affordability. So how are the best of the best keeping it all running smoothly, planning for the future of large loads while keeping costs and carbon down? I'm Kinsey Grant Baker, and today we are going to find out. I'm so excited to welcome our guests for today's episodes. We have Brooke Haman, Regulated Solutions Development Manager at Georgia Power, and Claire Gotham, Utilities Consulting Lead at Wipro. Brooke and Claire are both super smart, super thoughtful, and actually friends outside of this podcast too. So I'm gonna tag along here as a third wheel, try to insert myself in the conversation and have some fun with these incredibly successful, insightful women. And I want to start with a thank you to our partners at Wipro for making this episode possible. You will hear more about them in just a second. But Claire, Brooke, are we ready to talk about this balancing act? How are we doing today?
We definitely are. Yeah, especially after that intro. I want to have that intro every day.
I'd love for that to just come on the loudspeaker when I walk in the building.
I love it. Thank you so much for it is a balancing act. This is I imagine what it feels like. So we're going to talk about a whole lot today. So we have a lot to cover in this conversation. As I mentioned at the top, this is a big, tall order to balance all of these different elements for utilities. Before we get into more of the meat of this conversation and the solutions to this big challenge, I want to have 2 questions here to get us started. So Claire, why don't you kick us off by telling me a little bit more about your role leading utilities consulting at Wipro? What's top of mind in your work and your conversations that you're having with clients today?
Sure, I'd love to. And you've touched on it a little bit even in our intro, so I appreciate that. You teed me up perfectly. So leading Wipro Consulting for Utilities, I'm trying to help customers really navigate this very turbulent, very exciting time. And the things that they're really thinking about are, you mentioned, explosive demand. Right? Customer expectation that's shifting in a shifting landscape. And then how are they going to do this digital integration, in particular with AI, to achieve more with less, essentially? So my role is to help them look at all of those things and then cut through the complexity and figure out how do they find a practical path to it. So that's really what we're focused on.
Yeah, absolutely. Doing more with less, even if you're not a utility professional listening to this podcast, is something I'm sure anybody who's listening would be interested to hear more about. So I'm sure we'll get into a lot more of that as well throughout this conversation. And Brooke, you've spent a good deal of your career focused on renewables, program planning at Georgia Power. I would love to know a little bit more what your role is like today, and what challenges are keeping you the busiest, knowing that there are many of them to choose from. What would you say is kind of top of the list for you?
Yeah. So my role at Georgia Power is really focused on doing regulated program design. So that's programs that are primarily renewables, electric transportation, and resiliency programs for DER type of programs for all customers, residential, commercial, and industrial. And so everything from community solar all the way up to kind of large load, backup generation type of planning. And so, that's my role. I work heavily kind of with our renewables teams and then also with our integrated resource planning team. So, as we file kind of an every 3-year integrated resource plan. So that's most of what my role is right now. I would say the things that keep me up at night are figuring out how do we continue to evolve our suite of customer programs to meet customers' needs. We have such a wide variety of customers, and customers' needs are evolving at a pace that is faster than what the utility is accustomed to keeping up with. And that's not just on the program side. I think that's, their expectations across the board. And so, that's really what I lose sleep over, is how are we going to do this in a way that meets customers' needs fast enough, and how do we kind of modify our processes internally and externally to meet the customer demand.
Yeah, and pacing is going to be, I imagine, a very big part of this conversation. The pace at which utilities can operate and can adapt and can pivot is very different from the pace of change when we think about customer expectations or even data centers. So I imagine that's really going to be a focal point of this conversation. And with that, I think there's no better time than the present to get into it. Both of you mentioned when we were just chatting here, load growth, this idea of explosive demand. We are in the midst of something that it feels generational. There's huge demand growth from AI and data centers. In June of this year, of 2025, U.S. data center construction spending reached a record-breaking $40 billion, seasonally adjusted, up 30% annually in 2025, following a 50% annual increase in 2024. All of that is on top of the ongoing renewables transition, the electrification of everything, a lot going on. This is why we're so focused on this balancing act. I'm curious to hear what feels different about this moment compared to possibly past cycles of demand growth. Can you contextualize for us why the demand challenge feels really pressing and urgent today?
Sure, I'll jump in. I think you started to pull the thread, and I'll go ahead and unravel the whole sweater, which is the scale and the speed. So what we're seeing is not new as far as the activity or the function, but it's the scale and the speed of it that is really unprecedented. So having a single customer show up with a request that we would see in the past for a mid-size city, that is a huge scale difference. And that's just one customer, right? So you queue up, you have a few. If you're in a large metro area, you could have multiple of those. And then the speed, you alluded to it, but the speed that the customers sort of expect this, and Brooke also alluded to it, the way that utilities historically have done business and had business cycles is multi-year. You match that up with customers who now have quarterly expectations, quarterly activity that they want to see. Those two things, that mismatch is causing a huge amount of tension. So that's my perspective. As the outsider, I would love to hear Brooke's perspective as, really the practitioner of this.
Yeah. So, Claire, I think you hit the nail on the head. The sheer magnitude of growth is just what is different for us. We're seeing, growth that is in the gigawatts, whereas before we were really looking at growth in megawatts. And if you had a new load, we're not talking data center, any new load, large load, and it was 100 megawatts. My goodness, that was a big load for us to serve. And that got included in our planning process. And usually we had several years worth of lead time for that load. And now we're talking about loads that are in the hundreds of megawatts or gigawatt size, that are trying to add to the system in a matter of, 12 months, 18 months, 24 months. And our integrated resource plan cycle is 36 months. And so you can see how that misalignment creates some tension for us in being able to meet customer needs and to meet that scale of growth. And I think, Kinsey, you said one other thing that was, I think, at the heart of all of this, which is doing that in a way that is affordable and doing that in a way that doesn't compromise on the energy transition as we're, looking to do more renewables to meet customer needs. Adding that much generation, transmission, distribution overnight can be a challenge. So, I think all of those issues are kind of enmeshed together, and they're all exacerbated by the volume of growth.
Yeah, which seems to be the common denominator across our entire existence, right? Like not just the economy, not just utilities, but big tech has changed the scale and speed of just about everything we do, from the news to the power to, all of it. We have kind of talked briefly here in the conversation so far about what you just mentioned, Brooke, about the role of renewables and about the importance of affordability, two things that are key to any utilities planning, strategic planning, vision for the future. Those two things are very much at the center of those conversations. So let's take those two and unravel more of the sweater, as you put it, Claire. I like that. On renewables specifically and the transition, the energy transition specifically, you mentioned sort of meeting customer needs with also, and very much front of mind, the energy transition. One of those elements of the customer makeup, who the customer is, could be these large loads, these data centers, these hyperscalers that might have, a higher load factor than renewables can provide. If renewables aren't necessarily 24/7, how do utilities plan around load factors that data centers can expect, sometimes 90% plus uptime, with resources that might be more on the intermittent side of that spectrum? Brooke, I would love to hear a little bit more about how that kind of breaks down at a utility, how they're thinking about conversations like this, problems like this to solve.
Yeah, so it's a big challenge, right? We have been over the last 10 years kind of taking a very measured approach to broadening that piece of our pie, that green piece of our pie. And that's for all customers, right? And then I think what we saw along the way was we started adding these renewable subscription programs that customers could participate in. And even as we had some of these larger loads, they would participate in these renewable subscription programs that allow them to get all of those renewable attributes. But the challenge really has been cracking that kind of 24/7 nut, right? The high load factor. And candidly, I don't know that we've fully figured it out yet. We brought 2 new nuclear units online. That's, great around the clock, carbon-free energy. But again, when we're talking about this scale of growth, we're talking about, really, really high penetration of renewables that are going to be needed on the system, and then addressing the system impacts of that intermittent energy. You can do some of that with batteries, right? And so I think batteries are part of the solution. But I think, it's realistic and reasonable to say that we probably can't coat the entire state in solar panels and just do greenfield solar. I think we're looking at a lot of different solutions for customers, from figuring out how do we marry up some of the maybe like the rooftop solar solutions for residential customers and smaller commercial customers with some investments that maybe these larger data centers or larger industrial manufacturing type customers might be willing to make in order for us to help incentivize customers to add more rooftop solar. I think that's another potential solution that we're kind of circling around. And then I think there's, on-site generation as well. As much as, we can help customers pursue on-site generation to meet their energy needs, whether that's, rooftop solar on-site. Again, we're talking about really large loads. So just putting some solar panels on top of a data center is probably not going to meet their full needs. But I think it's part of the solution. And I think that's really the critical point, is that it's going to take kind of all the solutions or all the tools in the toolbox approach to help these customers not only meet their energy needs, but to do it in a way that, is in a less carbon intensive way.
Claire, what do you think about this? What would you add?
I think she's got a great answer. I think I definitely agree. Renewables are foundational, not 24/7. So we need exactly what Brooke described. I would put it in my own words as a sort of an improv answer, which is yes and like renewables and yes and what else are we going to do? And she described some of the different things to add on. So I think at this point we need to look at all of the options to meet the demand that we're seeing. So renewables, DERs, demand management programs, different structuring of customer incentives, approaches, contracting, a little skin in the game. I heard for some of the larger mega users. I think we need all of these things together to have a really strong, resilient portfolio and a strong grid.
Yeah. And this is something we've talked a lot about on Power Perspectives in recent months, is this idea that there is no silver bullet, right, for solving this problem. It requires a lot of inputs. It requires a lot of smart people solving these problems. And it's not that they're impossible to solve. It's just that it takes a lot of orchestration and a lot of planning and a lot of strategy and a lot of smart people like you to help us figure out all of that, with the end goal ultimately being, resilience, reliability, and affordability. And so I want to talk for a second here about that last one, about affordability specifically. Rising costs are stressful for anybody, whether you're a data center or a person who pays their Con Ed bill like I do at the end of every month in New York City. The average residential electricity rates jumped 6.6% over the last year as of June per some recent data from the EIA. So how does all of this, factor into the ways that utilities are planning for meeting this moment, meeting this challenge of the demand spike that we've been talking about today? And, specifically, Claire, I would love to hear your perspective on how the needs of some of these big load, data center hyperscalers impacts the average ratepayer and, the traditional utility industry business model. What's the relationship like there?
Sure. I think that there's two parts of it. And one is sort of the practical, what happens, what is the envelope risk that occurs to the sort of regular end user, right? The folks like you and I at our homes, whether it's Con Ed or Southern Company, and, small businesses. That there's that piece. And then there's the piece, the understanding around it, the communication. So on the first piece, I think that we are having to relook at how we have done it. In the past, it's been a more of a little bit equal, right? We spread it out for everyone. Everyone sort of pays for all of the things that are going in. But when we are seeing customers show up again with load that looks like a city, that is causing utilities to review, is that really equitable, right? Is that how we should do this so that, we end up having individuals and small businesses paying for the same sort of percentage share of that usage that they're not using. So I think that's really a push that utilities are making and reevaluating. We're seeing it, within the utility, we're seeing it with regulators and with their communities. I think the other part that they are leaning into and should lean into even more around this is, so I talked about the envelope risk. The risk to the utility is the person opens their envelope and they're like, oh, why is my bill so big? And I don't understand. And I know that this is a risk. I had dinner recently, just to let me an anecdote, in the Northeast with a woman that I work with, not in the same industry. She is in digital media and marketing, influencer, very, very sharp person, and was telling me about her provider in the Northeast. And she said, they just are taking all of my money. Our bill is going up so much. And when I explained to her what was sort of behind the recent rise, and once I explained it, she really understood the fact that she did not know, was not aware, given her just level of experience, her business acumen, et cetera. I'm like, okay, if this person didn't know this and had this feeling of utility X is taking all of my money, then we definitely need to do a better job with communication at all of our clients and stakeholders within the utility service territory, whether it's Southern Company or Con Ed you mentioned, or PG&E, whoever it is, right? More communication so that people understand the why behind why the rate increase needed to happen, why we need to put in more transmission, why there is maybe more generation planned, et cetera. So I think those two pieces, the envelope risk of, what's going to happen in the envelope, and then the reaction to it.
Yeah, Claire, I think you're right. Storytelling, I think from a utility perspective is really difficult. It's not that juicy of a story, right? Like it's kind of a story sometimes that makes you fall asleep. So as much as I
don't know who you're talking to. There are people you're listening to this that are going to be like, this is the juiciest story ever.
I know when I'm at dinner parties, I try to bring up utility conversation, especially, Claire, when our paths cross. But it's not always like the easiest story to tell, explaining to people how electricity goes from the generator to the customer and all of the different costs associated with that and how we recover those costs over time is, it's tough. It's highly technical stuff. And planning is highly technical. And so explaining all of that to customers and how you do that in a long-term fashion, and then trying to recover those costs over a long term so that it really doesn't break people's wallets. That's tough. But then also explaining to them, how do you modernize those recovery mechanisms so that they're more aligned with how folks are used to paying for things nowadays? I think the utility customer of 50 years ago is not the same as the utility customer of today. And by far and large, our recovery mechanisms are still the same as they were 50 years ago. We're starting to make some changes and some improvements in that. I think one of the things that we saw specifically within the Southern Company territory, Claire, I think this gets to your the first point you made about the envelope sort of shock or resistance was that in Georgia, our Georgia regulators voted that to update kind of our rules and regs and processes so that we are actually collecting some of the costs to serve these large loads, not just data centers, any large load. I think it's over 100 megawatts, so that we're collecting a big portion of those costs up front, and that there's some financial guarantees so that if those loads don't materialize the way that we are planning for them to materialize from a generation and transmission perspective, that all other customers, so that the residential customers, the small commercial customers, are not left holding the bag for that. And I think that that's a great example of a way that we have to kind of both protect, our customers, but ways that we're also, working with our regulators to modernize the way that we're doing business and protect those customers long term.
Yeah. And I love having the specific example like that, Brooke, because I think so often when we're talking about solving these problems, there's a lot of conversation around, we know what we should be doing, right? We have ideas for solving problems and meeting challenges, but it's always interesting to hear the specifics of how a specific utility is doing it, how a specific provider is approaching this problem. That one, I think, speaks a lot to the equity element of the affordability or the customer interest in this large load and this demand spike equation. When it comes to more of the storytelling, I'm curious if there are any examples that either of you have of somebody who's done it right, somebody who has approached this the right way. Because you're right, I am relatively new to energy. It's been a year since I have been working on this, and I have started to kind of wade into the waters of like dinner party conversation about utilities. And you're right, people's eyes kind of glaze over. They want to complain about their bill at the end of the month, but they don't necessarily love this the way that we love this. So short of coming on Power Perspectives and doing the storytelling, are there any other ways that you have seen, sort of an exemplary storytelling utility or provider or organization in your experience, either of you?
I mean, I'm just going to give you my blunt outside opinion as not someone working in the utility anymore, which I did a long, long time ago. I don't know that anyone's great at it. I think that that's an area that it's been long considered a real soft skill. And let's go back 5-10 years ago, maybe. And it was not a priority because the environment was different. The market was different. And it was the literal and figurative. We put the product into the pipe and we push it down to you, and you at the end, you get what you get and you don't catch a fit. And then since then, it has totally changed. And it's a bit of the sort of Amazon effect on every industry that customers look at, where they spend any money and they feel like I should have a level of service. I should have visibility into how this price is made, and also the increasing awareness around climate, around how energy functions. That's just really shifted over the past 10 years. People actually know what a megawatt is, or even know the word gigawatt, other than Doc Brown saying 1.21 gigawatt. I know, mispronounced. So I don't know that anyone does it well. I think the shift has been that pretty much most utilities, if not all, have now recognized, hey, this is an area we've not been focused in, or we've not been as focused in, and we really need to put some time into this, because what our customers think and feel is really important, not just do they pay their bill and, do it on time. So I don't know, Brooke, your thoughts on that?
A couple of things. So one is that I do think that energy and utilities and energy consumption, I think it's becoming more of a regular conversation topic as, as normal people out there in the community, normal users, like, all three of us, as it impacts our life every day. I think it's becoming more normal. And honestly, I think and maybe it's just me and my feed, but I think there's more information out there, more articles about it, particularly, around climate and, and about meeting all of these, needs that are out there, all these, really, really big energy needs that are out there now. I think there's just a lot more conversation out there about it. I still think that there's a lot to be said in terms of telling the story. And I think utilities, we can continue to improve on that. We have a lot of really good storytellers, I know, in-house at Southern Company, and we're constantly trying to figure out, how do we tell our story better to the customer? How do we get to them? Like, is it through the paper bills? Is it through online service center? Is it, through commercials? Is it through social media? How do we tell our story, and how will it resonate with customers better? And so, that's one side of that. I think the other thing to consider is the people who are maybe not, directly working for the utilities, or, directly utility related. I think there's a lot of folks, as an example, just kind of pulling from my past experience, we have a pretty robust solar community here in Georgia, solar development community. I think that there has been some really good, talented storytelling with the solar development community. I think they found messages that resonate with customers to increase adoption, and I think that that's great. I think that they made the story a little bit more palatable for customers and a little bit easier to understand. And now, solar, particularly rooftop solar, is one slice of the overall, utility offerings and, utility programming. But nonetheless, it's a part that seems to resonate with customers, and they get it. They get how, the sun creates energy on their rooftop, and how that offsets their usage from the power company, and how they can achieve more energy independence. That resonates with them. I think the more that we can develop messages like that make it, easy and palatable for customers, the more success we'll have in telling our overall story. But I think it certainly is going to require us breaking it down into digestible pieces.
Yeah. And I think more and more, the things that seem to resonate most with the people I'm having conversations with is when there is a really specific and unique and kind of like weird outlier example. I was explaining to my husband what the duck curve is the other day, and it clicked, right? Like, duck is a weird word. It's not something you're used to hearing, and it clicked for him. I think the more that we can do that, the more these stories resonate. But again, a lot of this comes back to things that just take time, and it's an unsatisfying way to figure out how to solve these problems, because we have this urgency, we're dealing with speed and scale that we haven't before, but again, things just take time, especially at utilities, whether it's storytelling or whether it's the 36-month cycle or the 3-year cycle for IRPs that you mentioned at the top of this conversation, Brooke. So let's talk a little bit about that. Let's talk about that discrepancy almost in the timelines for pivoting or being strategic at utilities versus some of these large loads or the customers that they are working with and working to serve. I would love to hear a little bit more about that pacing and whether or not it's changing. Is it something that's changeable? Is it something that we're just going to have to try to predict the future? What's the solution in this balancing act of time as such a critical element, and one that's mismatched between customer and provider?
Claire, I'd love to get some of your industry perspective, but I'll start. So I said this earlier, Georgia Power specifically is on a 3-year planning cycle, right? We had an integrated resource plan in 2022. We had one in 2025. But what we saw is just in that 12-month period between 2022 and 2023, we saw such an increase in demand, and we saw such an increase in forecasted demand that we actually went in and filed an interim IRP. We've done that twice that I'm aware of. Not saying it hasn't happened more than twice, but I subject to check. I think we've done it twice since the IRP statute was approved in 1992. So it doesn't happen frequently, but I think that that's a great example of, we saw that there was a need that was outpacing our planning cycle, and we went in as quickly as possible and filed an interim IRP or an IRP update. And so I think, I don't know that it's fair to expect that we would do that. I think that's that we would do that regularly. I think that's outside of our regulatory compact here in Georgia. We're not the same as every other state. There's a lot of differences in different markets and jurisdictions. But I think that was one way that we kind of tried to do a quick adjustment of the ship. I think another way was going in kind of in between regulatory cycles and doing that rules and regs update that happened in Georgia back in January. But candidly, I do think that it is a challenge aligning those timelines that are happening, like Claire said, some on a quarterly basis where they're updating their projections, and we're just trying to wrap our heads around, okay, this is what we're seeing in terms of requests for service. Now, how do we go meet all those requests, and are they materializing the way that they're projecting to materialize? How can we get a little bit more certainty around if they're going to materialize the way that we think they're going to materialize? I think that there's a mismatch there, and I think we're still trying to figure it out, certainly within Georgia. But I am curious to hear Claire's thoughts on how maybe other states are doing it differently, or other markets are adjusting a little bit faster, because I do think that there is a middle ground between come one, come all, and can't come here. So Claire, I'd love to hear some of your thoughts around, other folks that are adjusting incrementally.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right. Each state regulatory body, the regulatory environment is like a family. Like it's got the same name, right? This is a family, that's a family, but they're all very unique, right? And how they function, what their traditions might be, their interrelationships. So Georgia will be very different from New York, from California, from Missouri, for example. What I'm seeing is there definitely is a coming together on the timelines, right? From a utility timeline, which has traditionally been multi-year, the customer timeline, which is like crying now. Amazon Prime, like, I want my, interconnection today. The minute I thought of it, I want you to give me an interconnection. There is a coming together of those. I think in some other parts of the US, because they are operating in an ISO or an RTO, that it can be a little bit, I don't want to say easier, but because you have a collective of states that is operating under sort of one group with planning, et cetera, and the Southeast does not. Now that might change, not an official ISO or RTO, but, more regional planning could be something that we see. And then I think customers have to get out of a scarcity mindset. They're sort of making it worse by feeling that, okay, I might want 5 projects, connected in the next year. But there's a lot of other people, so I'm going to say 25. And then everyone does this. And it's almost like we're like when we had to buy toilet paper at the beginning of COVID. And I didn't really need 100 rolls of toilet paper, but I got worried because what if I needed, 20? So then we would everybody go to the store and buy toilet paper, right? I think that's what they're doing a bit, if I can use that COVID related analogy, is that some of them are adding to all of these interconnect requests or queues, which are then pushing them out 3 to 5 years, 6 years for projects that maybe don't really exist. So having a reality check on that side, the client side, right? While the utility in good faith is trying to accelerate their timeline through the mechanisms that Brooke identified, I think would be really helpful. And then I think more scenario planning, right? More as a habit, not just like we do it once or a year or twice a year, but like an ongoing updating of a scenario times 5 or 6. Like not as just one possible future, but what are some multiple possible futures? And let's just do the modeling for each of those and see what that looks like. Doesn't mean you build to all 5, right? But at least you start to look at what could be possible.
And having options is famously a good thing to have. It brings to mind too how, when we imagine those 5 different scenarios, there are other ways I imagine that some of these utilities are changing the status quo or how they have operated for quite some time because of this moment in time specifically. So with this idea of, modeling out what different versions of the future might look like, I'm curious if there are any other, more specific business models or partnerships that might be emerging. I know, Brooke, you mentioned briefly a change in the upfront cost situation. Are there any others? Claire, you might have some perspective on this as well. Any other sort of models or partnerships that are becoming options or becoming more popular to help meet this moment, to help balance all of this at the same time?
I think I'm definitely seeing utility clients having partnerships with obviously large scale technology companies that have traditionally been really just their customer. And now they're becoming a partner in a lot of ways, not just looking at generation, but looking at their own technology stack. How can we do things more quickly, more proactively versus reactively? And back to that, doing more with less, right? We're asking a lot of the utilities. We're asking them to face an aging workforce, increasing technology complexity, technical debt, also in the face of this explosive demand growth. So I'm seeing, they're really proactively going after more of these partnerships. And then also I'm seeing, and Southern Company is a great example of this with their Southern Ventures. And there are other entities that have similar arms, either inside internally or even spun out, but they have a group that is looking for active innovation, partnerships, sponsorships, companies that maybe are more nimble and more quick to react than they could be themselves, but they support them with mentorship, with, again, partnership, with allyship, but, funding, investments, funding, and connections. So I think that that's really important.
Yeah. And Brooke, do you have anything to add to that, Brooke, before we?
There is kind of an interesting approach that we're taking now, which is different than the approach we had from a planning perspective several years ago. Now we're looking at both, new loads and new generation in terms of clusters instead of individuals. And I think, looking at those clusters of loads or clusters of generation, on an annual basis instead of looking at them on an individual basis, I think is helpful because it allows us to look at different scenarios. Like, what if all of these loads come online? What if only a couple of these loads come online? And sort of evaluating a new portfolio each year of both loads and generation. I think that's a little bit different of a way of doing things than we've done it in the past. And so, that's perhaps another way that we're kind of changing the way that we're doing business. That's not unique to us. So, that's just one idea that came to mind.
An approach we're taking at Wipro, which is looking at large load infrastructure customers. And that's across industries. So I looked at utilities and they have a lot of similarities, needs, and load profile as airports, as large manufacturers, right? It's heavy energy usage. It's very steady. It doesn't really have a seasonality, and oftentimes part of critical infrastructure, right? We're required. We want these things. It's not a nice to have situation. So looking at them and how they operate and how they would need a variety of things, we are trying to look at them as sort of a bucket or a cluster, I think you said, Brooke, of customer types, which is new. That's not something we've done in the past. We've sort of really kept industries in their own sector silos. And now we are starting to look at them as more one group based on their behavior. So if you verify that you can keep it in, that would be my addition to that.
Yeah. And I love it. I think it, the benefit of living in this world where the scale and the speed of everything is snap of the fingers, is that we have the advantage of getting to learn from each other, of getting to see how other people are approaching issues and solving problems. And that's not just on like our Twitter feeds, right? That's also in a business sense, like you were mentioning, Claire. So it's definitely very interesting to hear what other industries can teach utility professionals, where we can identify patterns, where we can understand the world around us a little bit better by maybe getting outside of that like table of people who do want to talk about rates and envelope shock.
I do think though the y'all have both made like an interesting point, like you kind of circled around a point that I think is interesting, is that we can learn from one another, and utilities tend not to like to be the first one to do something. We're a little bit risk averse. And that's rightly so. That's, for the protection of customers. But I do think that we can learn from one another. I think the other thing to keep in mind, though, is that not all markets are the same. And I again, this kind of goes back to the storytelling piece, is like what works in California, what works in Texas, what works in PJM probably does not work perfectly in, Southern territory. And maybe like Duke, like the Carolinas, like maybe we look a little bit more like that, but just because it works there doesn't mean it works in Georgia, doesn't mean it works even, with our sister utility, Alabama Power. The same things do not work in both states. And so I think also there needs to be this recognition that we should be learning from each other, but we also, the same things don't work for every utility or every market structure, because they're so unique and they're so nuanced as well.
It's a really important point, Brooke. I'm glad you made it too. And you brought up an interesting concept that is certainly key to this idea of the balancing act that we've talked about on other shows at Energy Central as well. This idea that utilities want to be the first to go second. They don't necessarily always want to be the first to put a big risk out on the line. And not to say that that's a blanket statement. There are certainly outlier situations, as there would be with any of these ideas that we're talking about today. Claire, from a consultant's perspective, I'm curious to hear what you think about this idea of risk taking is certainly a big umbrella term, but this idea that some utilities might be more risk averse, but they're dealing with and operating with and partnering with entities or industries that are much more friendly to risk than utilities have historically been. What's your read on that?
Yeah, I don't know if it's friendly to risk or accepting that risk exists, right? And even inaction is an action, right? So if you're choosing to not do something, it doesn't mean that you're not courting risk, right? You're certainly not mitigating risk necessarily. I think the rush to be second is a very well-worn trope with utilities, but probably pretty well earned. I mean, my joke about them is that they're always a bit like teenage girls. They don't care if we as consultants think it's cool or the right thing to do. They want to know, is everybody else doing it, right? So I think that that's definitely, it's a trope because it's true. I think I see a few of the outliers that are able to operate, as you say, like not more risky, but to sort of step out. And one of them I'm thinking of is Hawaiian Electric. And maybe because they're literally on their own island, that they operate in such a distinct service territory that I do see them, they're oftentimes sort of front runners in some of these areas that eventually I see other utilities come along from a transformation perspective. And that's just one that popped in the top of my mind. But again, it might be that they have such a specific service territory that they're like, nobody has this situation, so we're going to have to make up our own path forward because we don't have another one to look at. Whereas I think that in the continental US, even though ERCOT is very different from PJM, is very different from CalISO, you can at least glean a few nuggets from where others have trode. So trode is not a word. Others have
Trodden.
Plowed.
It's been.
The road. I don't know.
Yeah.
You cut all that because I made up a word. I don't know what the word is.
Hey, there are no rules on power perspectives.
Well, you can keep them, but they'll know the intent, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, that's the one that pops to mind.
Claire, you're so good at these metaphors and analogies. I love it. Brooke, what were you about to say?
I was gonna say, I don't want to misrepresent the kind of risk aversion, because I do think it's important to call out, like Claire had mentioned earlier, that we have, a part of our company called our Southern Company New Ventures, where we're looking at, emerging tech and different partnerships and investments we can make. I think that that's one way that we're trying to take, some like maybe insulated risk. And then, we're constantly looking at kind of ways to innovate programs or develop innovative programs to meet customer needs, whether that's electric transportation or renewables, or just in different rate plans that we can provide customers so that, they have more regularity in the way that they pay their bills, or, the ways that they can see their energy usage. I think we're constantly looking at ways to be a little bit more innovative. I mean, again, it kind of goes without saying, like, Vogtle, the two new nuclear units, like it's not that we're completely risk averse. I think we just have to be very wise about how we take risk and how much risk we're taking and when we're taking it, and making sure that we're spreading that risk out and protecting our customers along the way, because otherwise then we get into this kind of imbalance between risk and affordability. So I think that that's an important kind of point to make, in that I think a lot of other utilities are struggling with that same thing, right? Is that we want to be innovative. We understand that, we need to do things new and we need to do things differently. But how do we do that without compromising affordability when there's so many other factors out there outside of our control that are already impacting affordability, and those costs are getting passed along to customers. So I know that there's a lot of folks out there trying to figure out different ways to kind of innovate and take on risk without impacting affordability. So I think it's worth mentioning.
Yeah, it's a great addition, and I think it's a good way to wrap up a lot of the different elements of this conversation. Balancing all of this is not necessarily a position a lot of people would envy. It's tough. It is notoriously tough. It's one of the toughest jobs in the space, is to understand affordability and appropriate risk tolerance, and the demand that we've talked about this entire conversation. Trying to balance all of that is very, very difficult. And to call out when the calculus of that risk is being, that math is being done right, that math is being done responsibly, and that math is being done in a way that prioritizes equity, that equity element that we've been talking about today. It's not easy. There are people who are doing it, and it's great to hear the perspective of two people who have been involved in those conversations and those efforts. So I have one last question for you here before we get into our quick lightning round.
Really quick before that, I did want to just really say quickly, I want to be clear, I was not saying anything negative that utilities being risk adverse. I think they're leaning into innovation, and I want my utilities the way I want my airline pilots. I want them safe, reliable, sober, well-rested. Please do all those things first, right? And then, like, if you want to be innovative as well, I think that's a call for the day for sure. But it wasn't derogatory in any way.
No, and Claire, I wasn't interpreting it as derogatory. I was more responding to my own previous comment that I had made about, like, oh, we like to be risk averse. So that
I was like, oh no, I'll hear about this later.
No. I was responding to my own previous comment that I, in hindsight, was like, ooh, that was probably not the right comment to make. So yeah.
The bottom line is you have to balance risk and innovation with reliability and affordability and the equity. And that is the ultimate balancing act, right? That's the spectrum that we've been talking about. And navigating where to fall on that is difficult. It's a tough bill to fit. So I have one last question for you here. This is purposely a little bit of a toughie, but I'm curious, if you had, a magic wand or a wish from a genie or something like that, what changes to policy, regulation, planning, what would be the most impactful to help utilities navigate this balancing act? What would give them the tools, the resources, the reality, the circumstances that they need to pull it off? Claire, do you want to give us a first go at this?
Sure. I think if I actually had a magic wand, then I would give each utility a real crystal ball so they can look into the future and do exact planning. Wouldn't that be amazing? But since I have magic at my fingertips in this scenario. No, but in reality, I would want to align the timing, right? Talk about aligning the timing, reconfigure the cost allocation. And we touched on that earlier. How do we pay for these things as they're coming in and make it really equitable? And then require really better, more frequent scenario planning. Those would be the three things to me that, as you said earlier, are not a silver bullet, but together, those three shifts would make a big impact, I think.
Everything Claire said. I think I have such a heart for our transmission planners right now. What a difficult task. I mean, transmission planning is challenging. It's very, it requires a lot of planning in terms of land use, and that becomes really tricky, figuring out how do you locate really big transmission across the state and get it, these generation is not always located as close to the load centers as it needs to be. And so I don't know what the fix is there. I don't know like what kind of magic I would use other than just to make it easier for them and make it more accessible for them to be able to do their planning process and make sure that they have 100% certainty on the loads and the generation that they're planning for. I really don't envy that job right now, because I think there's just so much hinging upon our ability to be able to build transmission from generation to loads. So that would be one thing that I would love to just fix. And I don't know what the fix is for it. I'm trying to think of what other thing that I would like.
Crystal ball for the transmission planners. There we go.
Yeah, fair enough. And we ended on this hypothetical, but so much of this conversation really is the reality of what it is to be a utility professional today. Balancing all of this at the same time is not easy, but as you both have given plenty of examples to suggest, it's not impossible. There are organizations, there are entities, there are innovators, there are smart people, there are utilities that are doing their best to manage all of this at the same time, to really do it all. And we have been really lucky to hear your perspectives on what that looks like today. So to finish out the conversation today, we are doing our lightning round. So the first question that I have for the two of you, what's an idea that might be overblown or overestimated in terms of importance about large loads? And what's something that we're not talking about enough? And if you could do it in a sentence, that would be ideal.
I think overblown is the myth that data centers are going to totally go off the grid. I don't think that that's the case. I think that they're going to have some of their own capability, but the reality is they still need the grid. I think we do not talk enough about water. These large load infrastructure, particularly data centers, they need a lot of water, and it does not come up in conversation very much. So I think those were the two things you asked about, and those would be my two lightning answers.
Okay, what I think is potentially overblown is that the large loads are going to make bills and rates go up. I think if you're doing your planning right, and I think if you're figuring out how to, like, kind of like we've done in our territory, figure out how to collect those costs up front, I think there's actually potential to make bills and rates go down. And so I think that's a little bit overblown, but we shall, we'll see with time.
Okay, the next one that we have here today, in a sentence, how would you sum up a smart renewables approach for a utility balancing this balancing act, navigating this balancing act? What does that look like to you in the simplest possible terms?
For me, it's not about megawatts on paper. It's about real megawatts that are deployed and that are reliable and backed up with the appropriate transmission and storage. So not on paper, but in reality.
To me, it's about all of the renewable solutions in the kit. I know I said it earlier, but it's about using every single one of the solutions, because not a single one of them is going to meet customer needs on their own. So we're going to need all of them.
I love it. And the last question that I have for the two of you today, what inspires you about working in the energy industry? What is something that you love about the work that you do, or something that keeps you going even when you're navigating something as difficult as this balancing act? Claire, why don't you kick us off?
Sure. I think, there is a challenge that Brooke alluded to. We were joking around a little bit about, the industry can be a bit wonkish, right? When you talk to non-industry people, and they can maybe even think it's, how dare they, dull. But I would say for me, really, it's about more soul, less title. And by that, I mean, it's not just about powering servers or systems. It's really about we're connecting people and communities and futures. So that to me is the big why I do this. More soul and less title.
For me, it's that I think we deliver the greatest product of all time to people. Electricity it's such a necessary product, and figuring out a way to do that in a way that's reliable, clean, cost effective. I'm not I'm not pandering. It is a puzzle, and that puzzle is like changing kind of, now like a lot quicker than it was changing before. It's like there's different pieces every time I look down. And so I think that's what keeps me motivated, is figuring out how to do that in a way that I feel like is really, really responsible, and being part of a company that's trying to do that in a really responsible way, and being part of an industry that's, taking on huge challenges, to continue to provide what I think is just the greatest product of all time.
You heard it here, ladies and gentlemen. Coolest product of all time. I agree. It is cool to work in this space. It's cool to solve problems and to meet challenges. And this conversation, I think, has been very much proof of that. So Claire, Brooke, thank you so much for joining us on Power Perspectives today. It has been so wonderful to learn from you and to hear more about your experience and insight. I really appreciate you both taking the time.
Thank you, Kinsey. It's been great.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
This episode is made possible by our partners at Wipro. Wipro is an AI-powered technology services company focused on building innovative solutions that address clients' most complex digital transformation needs. Leveraging a holistic portfolio of capabilities in consulting, design, engineering, and operations, Wipro helps clients realize their boldest ambitions and build future-ready, sustainable businesses. With a global workforce of over 230,000 employees and business partners across 65 countries, Wipro delivers on the promise of helping their customers, colleagues, and communities thrive in an ever-changing world. For additional information, visit Wipro at www.wipro.com. You can find a link to more information about Wipro in our show notes. Thank you again so much to our partners at Wipro for making this episode happen.